A fire on Mike Papantonio. When Enron fell more than a decade ago, the public was shocked to find out that the company had been stealing money from the employees' pension programs. The same scenario is now playing itself out in the states across this country. I have author and journalist David Sirota here to tell us what's happening. David, it used to be that government workers were willing to make a trade-off. They were willing to take lower wages in exchange for a little bit of security when they retired. That is pension programs and the ability to kind of live those golden years with that type of security. What's happening is the erosion of that security that's taking place all over the country right now, isn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing is a 50-state plan to try to cut guaranteed retirement income. And I use that phrase specifically because what so-called pension reformers are pushing is to eliminate the guarantee. They're pushing to replace traditional defined benefit pension plans which guarantee retirees a certain income. They're trying to replace those with things like 401k style accounts, with something called a cash balance pension, which basically takes away the guarantee of that income. And that is a violation of, as you allude to, the sacred promise that was made to those workers. And it really is sacred. When a worker 20, 25, 30 years ago says, listen, I'm willing to forsake higher wages right now for that guaranteed retirement income later, 20, 25, 30 years later to then say, well, we, the employer, are going to renege on that commitment. That is a violation of something sacred, because it's not like the worker can suddenly have those 30 years back to make sure that they've made a different decision. It's really a total bait and switch, and it's immoral.
Well, interesting, this article that you wrote, The Plot to Loot Workers' Pensions, I thought was just really well done as usual. And I thought the thing that struck me about it was that you had the Pew Foundation coming in and saying what we're saying is completely accurate, that there is an erosion of pension programs that runs the risk of destroying these people's lives in the very time that they need this money. There are no alternatives. They're not going to be able to even live on the money that they have in most of these pensions because they've already been raided. Then you add to that the story that we see coming out of Detroit, where it was the intent of the governor to say, well, we're going to get at the pension programs by declaring bankruptcy, and we're not going to have responsibility to pay these pension programs. That is kind of the formula that we started seeing in private industry. We saw it with Eastern Airlines. They were the first ones to use it, and it worked very, very well for Eastern Airlines. All these people were out of a pension program all of a sudden.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a scheme, a calculated scheme. Here's what's been going on. States, as the employer of public workers, have not been meeting their obligations to fund those pensions. And people understand this. If you're an employer in a private sector job, you may have a 401k, you may have a pension. Your employer is putting in money, and you're putting in money. So when the state doesn't put in its money, it's as if you're a private sector worker, your employer just said, all right, we're not going to fund what we're contractually obligated to fund for your retirement. So that's created a shortfall. Also, what's created a shortfall is the shenanigans on Wall Street, which tanked the stock market. Before the stock market crash, these pension funds were flush with cash. But now, because of those two factors, underfunding and the Wall Street breakdown, there are shortfalls. These shortfalls are manageable. These shortfalls are in total about $46 billion a year. And we know they're manageable because states are now spending $80 billion a year, according to the New York Times, on subsidies to corporations. So it's not like states don't have the money to replenish these pension shortfalls. But what's going on is you have conservative activists, ideologues, going into states saying, we have this shortfall that was created by Wall Street shenanigans and states underfunding these pensions, and we should now, because of these shortfalls, we shouldn't cut back on the corporate subsidies. We shouldn't reduce all those tax cuts that we used the money to pay for in the past. We should now cut the retirement benefits. So they're actually citing the problem they created in order to make the problem even worse for retirees.
I thought it was really interesting that you start off the story talking about the fact that the Pew Foundation, first of all, said this is the problem, that the elderly are not going to have any golden years, and that this promise that was made to them, if they were going to be working for the government, that they'll take less salary and they'll take more support, more security in the pension, that's a trade-off that will no longer even be relevant in a matter of 5 to 10 years. They know there's a problem, Pew, but nevertheless they reached this this bond with the Arnold Foundation. Tell us about the Arnold Foundation, and tell us what Pew Arnold is up to as far as trying to promote this idea that we must do away with people's pension programs.
Yeah, look, John Arnold is an Enron billionaire. That's where he made his money. He has funded the Arnold Foundation, which is working with the Pew Foundation to essentially launder his ideological agenda, make it look like it's pragmatic, academic, centrist, but it is a radical agenda. What he wants to do is apply the economics of Enron to people's pension plans. He comes out of a world that lives under the idea that it's every person for themselves. Every person can be a speculator and make lots of money in their 401k if they just invest it properly. It's not true. We've learned that from the stock market collapse. We've learned it from Enron when its collapse harmed, guess what? Public pensions. But John Arnold is basically using the Pew Foundation to make his agenda seem like it's the only agenda, and it's not the only path forward.
Why would Pew jump behind such an idea? First of all, I start from the position that Pew really does a credible job most of the time. That Pew, when you take a look at their numbers, you take a look at their research, it usually is not ridiculously ideologically driven. And it's a shock to me that Pew has said, yeah, we want to jump into the same program that Arnold's jumping into and convince states like California and Florida and Rhode Island and Arizona that, gee, you know, you really need to do away with your pension programs or you're going to go bankrupt because you have to give corporations subsidies or they're going to leave the state. That's kind of the pitch, isn't it?
That is the pitch. That's absolutely the pitch. Instead of getting rid of those corporate subsidies, Pew and Arnold are coming in and saying the budget shortfalls mean we need to cut guaranteed retirement income. Why is Pew involved in this? I think it's a good question. Look, Pew, I agree. A lot of its research in the last few decades has been genuinely pragmatic, centrist, and academic. It has right-wing roots. The roots of the Pew Foundation are right-wing. But I would say this, to answer your question directly, the question is, what kind of financial relationship does John Arnold have with the Pew Foundation? The Pew Foundation has asked for well-resourced partnerships, well-resourced partners. The question is, did John Arnold essentially buy this branch of Pew for his own, for what he wants to do? We don't know that yet, but it certainly looks like this. He's certainly throwing around his money to all sorts of front groups and foundations to try to get his way.
Well, certainly this mythology is already taking place. It's taken hold. When you start hearing the austerity argument, it's always the government workers that have to suffer the most from it. It's never the corporation that rarely, and this is very interesting. When you look at the numbers of what corporate subsidies actually bring to a community, it very seldom even pays off, much less makes a profit. But the idea is if we give these corporations a subsidy, they're going to come here and they're going to prosper. Now, there's another part of that. The part is the people living in that community still have to make enough money for the entire community to prosper, for that entire local community or state community to be able to do well. And that part of the argument is never told. I see Rhode Island slashed their guaranteed pensions by about $75 million, according to your article, to retired, and instead, excuse me, let me phrase it this way. They slashed their money for retirement and took at least $75 million of that money and put it towards building a baseball field. We see that not just in Rhode Island, we see that's a trend we see happening throughout the country.
Everywhere. Yeah, that's right. And Rhode Island is a very good example of what happened. Rhode Island cut its cost of living increases to its pension funds, public workers, by $2.3 billion and used $2.1 billion of that recovered money to pay fees for the new hedge fund managers that are now managing some of those private accounts. At the same time, as you allude to, the state is spending $300 million a year total on corporate welfare subsidies, including that headline-grabbing subsidy to former Red Sox pitcher Curt Schilling. It is a complete bait and switch. And I want to make one last point because you're right to touch on it. The corporate subsidies that states are spending often are wasted. They do not create jobs. What we do know is that when states fully fund their pensions, when you put money into the hands of retirees who are making $20,000, $25,000, $30,000 on their retirement benefits, that's actually far more reliable local economic stimulus than handing over $75 million to Curt Schilling's failed video game company.
Yeah. So as we look at this story, I'd like to say that Rhode Island was just one example. But the truth is, you see it in your list is incredible. Detroit, Kansas, Florida. I mean, it's happening all over the country. We have the governor of every state actually trying to convince the citizens of the state that it's some kind of welfare to pay these government workers that have put in 30 years into this one job, low wages all the time, and it's corporate, and it's welfare, and at the same time, the real welfare is to the corporate entities that are right there in the backyard, that if you simply cut that corporate welfare, there's more than enough to pay for these pensions, isn't there?
No, absolutely. Again, the number is, Pew cites a $1.38 trillion 30-year pension shortfall. That's the collective number. That's $46 billion a year. The New York Times reports that states and cities are spending $80 billion a year on subsidies to firms. So you don't even have to get rid of all those subsidies. You could get rid of some of those subsidies to make the pension systems whole. And the politicians aren't talking about that. Now, why aren't they talking about that? Because, of course, the beneficiaries of the corporate subsidies just so happen to be some of the politicians' biggest campaign contributors.
Yeah, the New York Times, as you point out in your article, said that we're losing $80 billion every year that communities are giving to companies because that revenue that the company is supposed to generate is actually eaten up so many other ways, right?
Absolutely. Again, you have all sorts of evidence that these subsidies do not create jobs, do not create public revenues. They are complete giveaways. And I just hope that everybody who's watching this understands, the next time you see a politician in your state plead poverty to justify cuts to guaranteed retirement income for public employees, you should go to the New York Times website, look up your state, look up how much your state is spending each year on subsidies to already wealthy mega corporations, and then ask yourself, why is the politician telling me that the state is out of money? Clearly, the states are not out of money. What they're really saying is we are choosing to use money that we are supposed to be paying to retirees. We are choosing to use that money to hand it over to our big campaign contributors.
Yeah, and when they see those numbers, they're going to have to fight their gag reflex, aren't they?
Absolutely.
David Schroeder,
it's really grotesque.
thank you for joining me, okay?
Thank you. Thanks for having me.